life would have been beautiful.
You need to get out of here now. There are just these voices in my head.
I didn't want you to know what you were born into.
You don't even answer any of my questions. You don't even
I
mention
wanted to give you a life outside of the context of death.
You need to know what it's like to not live surrounded by the only things you know. I mean, that's what's doing this to you.
Hello, my name is Obed de la Cruz, and I am the writer and composer of an original horror musical titled La Llorona, which I wrote as part of my Honors in the Arts. The musical is set in the countryside of Puerto Rico, in a town named Corozal, and it is inspired by the Latin American folktale of the Weeping Woman, or La Llorona. La Llorona is the ghost who is said to live in the river as she looks for children to take as her own. In this story, we follow Elena, a seamstress who tends to keep to herself because of her traumatic history in the town, but who has nevertheless decided to start her own tailoring shop. When her son, Gabi, unexpectedly comes back home after having run away just 4 years earlier, Elena is forced to face her fears head-on. As tensions rise inside the house, and as a ghostly yet familiar presence is awakened in the river, this musical finds its characters tangled in a complex web of history, fear, and past selves. The musical navigates themes of family, identity, and the enduring effects of colonialism on the island of Puerto Rico. Throughout the show, we experience the world through Elena's eyes. For a very long time, the events that have taken place in Elena's life have forced her to wonder if she is cursed. She's trapped in a society that was constructed against her best interests, but also one that somehow keeps her captive by her own design. Elena is controlled by her past, by what she's used to, by what's worked for her so far, and it is not until her son's mysterious arrival that she is forced to confront why she still lives in the town that she fears so much. In March of 2021, I directed the first ever production of La Llorona. The show was produced virtually as part of Sanford Rams Head's 2021 winter show in collaboration with Blackstage. Corozal is a mountainous town near the center of the island, and it's just north of a town named Naranjito, which is where I was born and raised. Growing up, I was surrounded by family and tradition, and I was fortunate enough to have been exposed to music from a very early age. My family makes up one of our local church choirs, and the music that they played and sang every Sunday was the music that shaped me as an artist and as a person. I wanted to honor my family's stories with this musical, and it was important that I did this in a way that felt new, mostly as a testament to the idea and fact that Puerto Rican stories can and should be told in new ways. As I began to develop the idea for this musical, given that my exposure to theater till that point was fairly limited, my assumption was that horror theater was a genre that had yet to be created. Very early during my research process, however, I discovered that horror actually has a fairly expansive history on stage. We can see earlier examples such as the early 19th century Grand Guignol Theater, which consisted of gruesome and horrific scenes that were constructed to look as real as possible. Though a character in a Grand Guignol show, may die in a melodramatic death, the naturalism was reserved for how they died, whether it be a man amputating his hand with an axe, or a woman being skinned alive on stage. The shows at the Grand Guignol Theater were so explicit and horrifying to witness that a resident doctor was actually on site to treat the audience members who fainted each night. Musical theater has also had its fair share of horror musicals. Shows like Phantom of the Opera, Sweeney Todd, The Demon Barber of Fleet Street, The Rocky Horror Show, among others, have all contributed varying interpretations and iterations of horror aesthetics onto the stage. Whereas Phantom uses gothic aesthetics to deliver its atmosphere, and Sweeney contains graphic violence that pays homage to its penny dreadful source material, my musical attempts to construct a theatrical experience that is inspired by the techniques used in some of my favorite horror films. While writing this show, I find myself thinking a lot about the techniques used by James Wan in Insidious and Jennifer Kent in The Babadook. It was important to me to use horror for this show for many reasons, But at the core of the creation of the show was a desire to create something that had a visceral effect on its audience. One of my favorite aspects of experiencing horror cinema is the physical experience of fear on the body and the mind. When paired with a meaningful story, horror can serve as a challenging yet immersive medium of storytelling, and it was important that I engage in this element of play while representing the people that I grew up with. The history of Puerto Ricans on stage is itself varied and complicated, with shows ranging from West Side Story, a musical that's notorious for its skewed perceptions of Puerto Rican identity, to the infamous Broadway flop, The Cape Man, to the hit sensation In the Heights. As someone who was born and raised on the island, I wanted to make sure that no matter how much spectacle the show contained, the story and the world and the style of communication between characters felt real to a Puerto Rican audience member. The horror genre allowed me to challenge myself to not only explore the joys of the Puerto Rican countryside, but also the darkness and the shadows that lurk all over the island. Looking at these shadows head-on often give us glimpses into the ugly truths of life. And in the case of Puerto Rico and Corozal, these ugly truths come with very ugly histories, but also useful lessons. My musical exists in the context of not only the folktale it is based on, but also the stories that have surrounded it. La Llorona herself is a specter that exists in most Latin American cultures, but her presence in history tends to vary between countries. In historian Cayetano Colitosta's book, Leyendas Puertorriqueñas, or Puerto Rican Legends, we can find the story of Guanina. In this story set during the time of Spanish colonization, a Taino woman named Guanina falls in love with a Spanish officer named Don Cristobal Sotomayor, and when he is killed during a Taino uprising, Guanina decides to die with him. Knowing Guanina's story, especially how it exists in conversations with interpretations of women and mothers in folk tales and ghost stories, one can start to see the influences on folk tales such as that of La Llorona. One important deviation in my title character's story, however, is that she was specifically a mother. While brainstorming and developing the story for this musical, I wanted to make sure I remained critical and attentive to how the character of Elena and La Llorona fits within the archetype of the monstrous mother. In her book, The Monstrous Feminine, Barbara Creed explores the concept of objection as it relates to the image of the monstrous mother in horror cinema, which in this case I'm also choosing to apply to horror theater. Creed draws from Julia Kristeva's theory of objection, developed in her book Powers of Horror. For Kristeva, objection is intimately tied to a sense of violated boundaries. The abject is that which does not respect borders, positions, rules, that which disturbs identity, system, order. Creed uses this definition to explore different manifestations of the monstrous feminine, with the maternal body featuring as a key example. Kristeva argues that all individuals experience objection at the time of their earliest attempts to break away from the mother, and the child's attempts to break away, to assert the boundaries of its own self, the mother becomes an abject, a threat to those boundaries. We can see objection at work in countless horror films where the child struggles to break away from the mother, in a context in which the father is invariably absent, such as in Psycho, Carrie, or The Birds. In these films, the maternal figure is constructed as what Creed calls the monstrous feminine. By refusing to relinquish her hold on her child, she prevents it from taking up its proper place in the symbolic order. In La Llorona, Elena finds herself in the position of both the abject and the child while she navigates her relationship with her son and her haunting spirit, respectively. But Elena is not only disoriented and scared, she is also constantly reminded of harm, specifically harm at the hands of men. Still living in the house that her husband ran away from, and now also having to confront a son that also ran away with her money, Elena's world is a loop of reminders of the patriarchal cloud that surrounds her life in the island she calls home. But as a result, her son Gabi experiences a turbulent relationship with a troubled mother instead, one who he struggles to leave, and yet cannot feel entirely safe around. My creative process for this musical has been as much about the writing and composing as it has been about the learning. During the 2 years I spent writing the show, I read countless plays, listened to many musicals, and received incredible guidance and instruction from professors, including playwrights Amy Freed and Youngjin Lee. But I still chose to maintain my original process for music making. My music experience at the start of this process consisted mostly of my years in band during middle school and high school, and throughout those years I engaged with music composition that was inspired by instinct rather than theory. So for La Llorona, I would describe this process in 4 steps: inspiration, instinct feeding, and construction. The original inspiration for this musical actually began when I first saw a national touring production of Phantom of the Opera. One of the most memorable moments of this musical happens at the end of the first act, in which a chandelier that has been hanging over the audience during the entirety of the show comes plummeting down. It was during this moment, while the audience screamed as they watched a chandelier fall on top of them, that I was introduced to the visceral effect that live theater could have on an audience, as well as the immense potential of the horror genre on a musical theater stage. During intermission, I decided that I too would write a musical that would successfully scare its audience. While trying to decide on what story I would tell, I remembered my interest in the tale of La Llorona. It was a story I grew up hearing as a child, and I was immediately inspired by what that story meant in the context of the island, a sort of cautionary tale about motherhood, colonialism, and the very real fear of the dark. The instinct process began while I sat in my bed one night and started singing to myself. Soon enough, I had created a catchy tune, and just so I wouldn't forget it, I decided to record a voice memo of that melody. I called it Bohemia, which refers to the family gatherings I grew up going to. For my family, a bohemia is a time to come together by your own accord, bringing guitars, cuatros, and any other instruments to sit outside together and sing folk songs through the night. With this first inkling of an idea, I only had one lyric, which would become the guiding theme of the show. I can't pretend to know the stories of another time ago. I can't pretend to know the stories of some time ago, but I can tell you them real clear. I knew vaguely what I wanted the backing track to sound like, so I used software instruments on GarageBand to recreate the sound. This specific style of rhythms for the song were inspired and derived from the music that accompanies trovadores, which are oral poets that perform through musical improvisation. I'm using the simple rhythm for the chorus, but later in the song, we hear it transition into a rhythm for the guitar that suits the seis con décima improvisation pattern. Seis con décima refers to the style of music as well as the meter for the poetry. Seis, which translates to 6, is the name of the style of music that accompanies a trovador. Décima refers to the 10-line poem with specific rhyming scheme that the trovador improvises during the seis. In this specific scene, the seis con décima is delivered by the character of Manolo, who grew up with Elena in Corozal and has now begun to help her start her business. In this final stage, I begin building around the core idea. I experiment with rhythms, I start layering and trying out vocals and harmonies, and I begin building from the inside out until I have something that feels full. And here's the final product.
I can pretend to know the stories of another time ago, but I can hear the echoes. All the people throughout the centuries made these mountains green and golden. We can hear their lives unfolding, cause our land is just their memory. From a creek the water raging, carrying in it crystal sunlight, bringing a reflection so bright to the face of a young child. So we learn to reconcile that a simple life is alright.
Thinking about the future of this musical, I look forward to exploring how the show behaves in different contexts and what kind of space it occupies in each respective iteration. Due to the COVID pandemic, the first production of La Llorona had to be created entirely virtually, which meant that my understanding of the show is still currently limited to its virtual context and reception. Nevertheless, as I transition out of Stanford and move to New York this summer, my plans are to continue workshopping the script and music for a possible stage production, while also being very conscious and intentional about which audiences I expose these workshops to, and which actors and creatives I collaborate with throughout the journey of this show. Making this musical has taught me more than I could have ever known about myself and about art making in spaces and industries that can too often feel unwelcoming. With a chilling ghost story at its heart, this musical has allowed me to find the music in even the darkest corners of Puerto Rican identity and history, and above all, has given me the opportunity to tell my version of our story on the island in the most honest way I can.
Sing me a song, the one about the feelings never had. Tell all the children stories of the childhood ever was. And yell and scream the hymns, the ones that no one got to write. Whisper to me the secrets of the truths that weren't mine. As to the bodies working under heat and sweat and mud. As to the heroes before the rivers start to flood. As to the colony before they sold this land in blood. As to the ones that live, and to the ones that live. I can hear the echo. I can hear the echoes.